we are in modern-day Rome, and we are near the Colosseum in the heart of the Old City. One of the things that is often misunderstood about the papacy, all throughout history and all the way down until today, is that the Vatican, though universally important for the Catholic Church and a very important place for both tourism and the power of the Roman Catholic Church, is not the seat of the papacy. Now, of course, the papacy is the universal head of the Catholic Church on earth, and so therefore the fact that the papacy is very often residing in the Vatican itself makes the Vatican often seem to be as if it were the seat of the papacy. But the Pope is the Bishop of Rome. Rome itself is his diocese. And therefore the Vatican is not the seat of the Pope as the Bishop of Rome, but rather it is the place of the universal church itself. In his function as the Bishop of Rome, the papacy does in fact have his own cathedral. Now, a cathedral in a Catholic system, and in some other church traditions like Anglicanism, for example, is the seat of the diocese. It is the church where the bishop's power resides. And this is symbolized very often. If you go to the back of a cathedral, you will typically see a chair sitting there on its own. That chair represents the bishop's power, and in Latin, the word for chair is cathedra, and this is where we get the name cathedral, the idea being that a bishop's power, his ability to sit in judgment and proclamation and in authority over a diocese, is represented by this chair. Well, if you were to look for the Bishop of Rome's chair, his cathedral, you would actually end up outside of the Vatican itself. You would be down near the Colosseum of Rome, and just several blocks away, you have the Lateran Church, sometimes referred to as St. John Lateran. And it is an impressive church. If you ever go to Rome, you should go and see the Lateran Church. It is one of the most important places in Catholic history. Perhaps you've heard of important councils called the Lateran Council. For example, the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which decreed that communion is to be understood as being transubstantiated or physically becoming in its properties the body and blood of Christ. And there are a number of other historical moments that happen at the Lateran Church that are vital for understanding Roman Catholic Church history. Well, if you go there today, you will notice that beneath the altar, down some steps, is buried the tomb of Martin V. Martin V is in many ways the central feature of the Lateran Church today, if you go and visit it. And for many tourists, it might seem strange that someone they've never heard of is the central feature of the Bishop of Rome's cathedral. However, historically, Martin V is one of the more important popes of the latter Middle Ages, because Martin V was the pope who restored the Catholic Church from the schism when there was at one point 2 popes and then 3 popes. It was a crisis of enormous complexity that saw the church divide itself and then saw arise the theology of what we know as conciliarism, which is the view that the pope is not the head of the church or its final authority, but rather the Pope answers to a council or answers to the body of the church as a whole. Ideas that, of course, would come home to roost in their own way in the Protestant Reformation. So Martin V is the grand unifier of the Catholic Church to end the schism. And so in this lecture, we're going to look at the rise of the Papal Schism as it came out of the Avignon papacy and as it began to develop into this worldwide conflagration, as first there were 2 popes and then there were 3 popes. And then we're going to look at some of the theological impulses around the time of the latter Middle Ages that sought to answer the problem of what do you do with renegade popes. And in the end, we will look at how these ideas, conciliarism in particular, began to develop and shape what we would today call papal infallibility, or the idea that only the Pope is the one who has final authority in the Catholic Church. Well, the context of the Papal Schism is the Avignon papacy, which we were looking at in our last lecture. And the Avignon papacy goes from 1337 down to 1378. And as we've also looked at, these were the years of the height of the 100 Years' War. And, more importantly, as we'll look at in the next lectures, there began to arise during this period a number of voices in the theological world who began to challenge the papacy and its doctrinal understanding of certain key doctrines, notably the sacraments and the role of the Pope in the Church. And the two most important figures were Wycliffe and Jan Hus. And so you have to look at all of these issues as one composite picture, because they were all beginning to happen really at the same time. But more specifically related to the Papal Schism, we need to say a couple things about the vocabulary being used. Unfortunately, historians have at times used the same word to describe two or sometimes three different events. So, for example, the word the Great Schism could refer to the break between the Catholic Church of the West and the Byzantine Church, which happened in 1054. Very often the Great Schism, when referred to by historians, means this moment when East and West split, a split that is in effect all the way down until today. Sometimes the phrase the Great Schism, though, refers to the events that we're going to be discussing here in this lecture. And some historians, noting that we use the same phrase for two different events, have begun to call the Great Schism of the papacy by a different name. Sometimes the Great Papal Schism, sometimes just simply the Papal Schism of the Middle Ages, and these kinds of things. Well, we're not going to concern ourselves too much with what we're going to call it. This is one of the things that ravages the latter Middle Ages. And during the Reformation, this is one of the things that is cited by Protestants as an example of the corruption of the papacy from the High to the latter Middle Ages. Well, what happens to start the Papal Schism is that as the Avignon papacy ends in 1378, Gregory XI brings the papacy back to Rome. And Gregory was under a lot of pressure to do this. There were a number of voices saying that the Pope should be back in Rome, that the successor to Peter needs to be at the site that was traditionally, at least according to the Catholic Church, believed to be the site of St. Peter's role as the first pope. And so Gregory XI brings the papacy back, and then he dies within a year. And so the cardinals gather together then, as they do even today, to elect the new pope. And the College of Cardinals at this time is overwhelmingly French. After having been so long in Avignon in southern France, there were a number of Frenchmen. And not surprisingly, most of the popes that had been elected in Avignon were French. However, as the College of Cardinals meets, and as they are deliberating as to who will be the next pope, the locals in Rome, the Italians, began to riot. And they began to storm and bluster that they wanted and they demanded that the College of Cardinals elect, finally, another Italian pope. One account even says that the rioters managed to get into the room below where the cardinals were meeting, and that they somehow jammed pikes and swords and things up through the floorboards in a show of violence to force the cardinals to do their bidding. And so, not surprisingly, the College of Cardinals elected an Italian to be pope, Urban VI. And the cardinals, of course, are not too happy about this, but Urban could have salvaged the situation if he had been gracious in his victory. But Urban VI was not. In fact, Urban VI is one of the angriest popes ever to hold the throne. Urban had the habit of excoriating the cardinals and calling people half-wits and other names in public, and he would at times scream himself hoarse at people, and he was just simply a real nutcase in terms of his leadership style. He seemed to believe that the authority of the papacy allowed him to treat others as if they were idiots. And so the French immediately began to doubt their choice as pope. And so the minority of the cardinals, the French ones in particular, end up declaring in their own private meeting that Urban VI was not to be actually elected pope. In other words, they rescinded their vote, even though it had been done according to the rules, and even though Urban VI was properly consecrated as the pope. And so the French said that Urban should not have been made pope, and in fact, the French were the ones who leveraged the point about the rioting Romans, and they said that they were fearful for their lives, and therefore their decisions, though seemingly done by the books, was now invalid. And so they elected another pope, Clement VII. Only there was one problem. Urban VI was not going to step down. And so Clement VII decided that he was going to move back to Avignon, back to the Palace of Avignon, and that he would simply return the papacy to its incarnation as it had been for the past roughly 60 years, back at Avignon. And this move, the College of Cardinals first electing Urban VI, and then a smaller number, overwhelmingly French, electing another pope, and then the two popes splitting up between Rome and Avignon, is the beginning of the Papal Schism. And it really needs to be said that this is incredibly important. As much as it's easy to sort of poke fun at this, you have to realize that all throughout Europe, you have a number of kings and rulers who simply have no idea what to make of this. Imagine yourself as king of, say, England. How do you determine which is the proper pope? You weren't there, you don't know the circumstances, you're only receiving things by letters and by messengers coming to your court. How do you know which one is the true pope and which one is the anti-pope? And more importantly, as time developed, both popes began to issue proclamations. If there was a vacancy in a bishopric or a vacancy over an important place like a monastery that required papal approval for the appointment of the successor, it could very well be that you would get two sets of instructions from two different popes. And there's one thing you don't want to do is to pick the wrong side. Because if you pick the wrong side and that one is deposed, congratulations, you now have an enemy in the existing pope. And so what happens is Europe essentially divides politically. Not surprising, France backs the Avignon pope. And those who are French allies, such as Scotland and Spain, also sided with the Avignon pope. Those who sided with the Roman pope were England and the Holy Roman Empire, as well as several others. But the division was unnatural. Significant numbers of people throughout Europe as a whole simply had no clue as to who was running the church. And that crisis of leadership and that crisis of authority was profound. Now, one other thing needs to be said about this. It is not uncommon that there would be a disputation over leadership, particularly not in the Middle Ages. There were times also when the papacy was filled by a dirty, rotten sinner. Catholics all the way throughout the Middle Ages, and frankly all the way down until today, would not be all that shocked that some of the people to hold the papacy were bozos. And they wouldn't necessarily be shocked or thrown out of a loop in terms of their theology of the Catholic Church, simply by acknowledging that there was a time of a crisis like this. The typical way you would deal with a case like this in the Middle Ages is you would simply wait for one or both of the popes to die. And if one or both of the popes dies, it was customary that those who backed the pope that had now died would shift their allegiances to the other one, and la-di-da, the schism is now healed. So in other words, the papal schism is not so much controversial for the fact that it was a schism and that there was controversy, but as we're about to see, the problem is that it endured, and it continued on after the death of both of these popes. So for example, in 1394, Urban VI dies. And you would have thought that the Holy Roman Emperor and the King of England and those who were loyal to the Bishop of Rome would have simply said, okay, now we will come back together with the Avignon Pope. But for a variety of reasons, this didn't happen. In fact, the Roman contingent went on and elected another pope, Boniface IX. In time, the Avignon papacy does the same thing. They elect their own pope. After their pope dies, they elect a successor, Benedict XIII. And so as we get closer and closer to the year 1400, it becomes increasingly clear that the schism is going to endure, and that it doesn't seem likely that at any point there would not be two lines of tradition of the papacy itself, one in Rome and one in Avignon. And so, during this period of time, in the run-up to the election of additional counterpopes, there arose a theological tradition known as conciliarism. And conciliarism is the belief that a council is the final court of appeals for remedying situations in which the Pope himself is in question. Not only that, but conciliarism began to argue that the council in all matters of the faith was the superior body and that the Pope himself was not the final authority in Rome. Now, there were a number of scholars and theologians around Europe who can be classified as conciliarist. But we're going to focus on three of the most important ones and just sort of outline a few of the things that they had to say. Perhaps the most politically active of the conciliarists was Jean Gerson. And Gerson was the chancellor of the University of Paris, sometimes called the Sorbonne. And Gerson's ideas were powerfully influential in shaping the concept that there needed to be a council to solve the problem of the Papal Schism. He wrote a number of treatises, but Gerson was most influential in shaping the councils themselves. There were, however, two theologians and writers who wrote several of the most important treatises and books on the subject that are read even down until today. The first was William of Ockham. And Ockham's theology is vital for understanding the latter Middle Ages. His theology was one of the most important for shaping some of the latter Middle Ages ideas of penance and the Christian life, and it's some of these ideas that Martin Luther, in particular, will reject entirely. But Occam also waged war on this issue of the Papal Schism. And the reason Occam gets into the situation is because he is unhappy that eventually one of the anti-popes sides against the Franciscans on the subject of poverty. Now, throughout the Middle Ages, following the model of Francis of Assisi, the founder of the Franciscan order, the Franciscans held to the idea that a monk must never own property. And they based this on the idea that Christ himself and the apostles were not property owners. And therefore, for a monk, they said, to own anything at all was to go against the apostolic and the Christological model of being a celibate monk. And there were lots of fights about this. The Franciscans often came under fire for their strong beliefs about owning property. Franciscans were a bit snobbish towards other monastic houses and orders that allowed for a certain relaxation on the concept of owning certain things or of having certain comforts. Well, one of the anti-popes at this time actually rescinds a decision by an earlier pope on the subject of poverty, and this set Occam off. And so he steps in with his theology of how the papacy must answer to the church at large and must itself not be the supreme authority in the church. In other words, Occam's position was driven by the fact that he did not like where the papacy had gone with a certain subject. But Occam's ideas are influential. He contends that it's not the papacy, but the power of the people of the church as a whole that confers the authority to the papacy. And therefore, the papacy must live in some sense under the guidance and the direction of the church as a whole. He is a realist in many ways. He believes that the papacy can be a sinner and that he can make wrong decisions. And therefore, Occam wants a certain amount of checks and balances against the papacy. The other influential figure is Marsilius of Padua. And Marsilius is similar to Occam, but he is more principally concerned with the issue of authority and power itself. And Marsilius is considered one of the forerunners to the idea of representative government, at least in a far back sense, in the sense that he adds some things to the Western bloodstream that will eventually bloom in the early modern period and in the modern period itself with the idea of representative government versus power being located in one individual. And Marsilius puts all of these ideas to work against the papacy, and his work is called Defensor Pacis. And in it, he argues that it is Christ who is the head of the church and not the papacy. Now, this is a radical idea, and it's certainly one that Protestants will embrace. But Marsilius does believe that the church is still infallible in some ways. But he argues that it is people, the church as a whole, the body of Christ itself, that is infallible. Therefore, he argues that whenever a proclamation is made by the church, whenever particularly a council comes together representing the church as a whole, he believes that that decision by a council is itself infallible. The Pope himself is not, but the council is. Well, how do all these ideas come to bear on the Papal Schism? Well, with the work of Gerson, there was finally called a council with the goal of rectifying the issue of the schism. And this met in 1409, and this was the Council of Pisa. And this council attempted as best it could to solve the crisis. The decision they ultimately come down on is that the popes, the two anti-popes in both Rome and in Avignon, are to be deposed. They rescind their election as pope, and they elect another pope by the name of Alexander. Now, if Alexander had lived a long life and had sustained himself as pope, it might very well have been the end of the schism. The problem, though, is that he died within a year, died actually in just a matter of months. And so the Pisan Council, still in session, decided to elect another pope, and they elected John the 23rd. And the problem with John the 23rd, however, is he was not a very good man. He was of a low moral quality, and this was widely known. And so, not surprisingly, those who heard about this decision did not back John the 23rd, and more importantly, none of the powers that be, none of the more important rulers of Europe stepped in at this point. And so, rather than heal the schism, the Council of Pisa actually made it worse, because now there were 3 popes. And in this case, John the 23rd moved to the city of Pisa, and there he ruled for a period of time as the 3rd pope. And it's only at this point, when the schism is getting worse, that finally the most powerful ruler in Europe decides to intervene. And that man is Sigismund. And Sigismund is Holy Roman Emperor, and Sigismund is going to play an important role in our later lecture on Jan Hus. But in this case, his desire is to see an end to the schism. He sees that it's getting worse, he sees no end in sight, and therefore he steps in and demands that John the 23rd call a council himself to end the schism. Now, Sigismund is powerful enough, and John the 23rd simply has to give in, and so there is finally summoned the Council of Constance. And the Council of Constance met for 4 years, from 1414 to 1418. Now, John, being shrewd, realizes that he has the power on his side. John believes that with the council, he has enough Italian cardinals, because he has stocked the deck with them, to essentially override any vote that might go against his wishes. And yet the council sees this and it puts a stop to it. It was decided that, in fact, at the Council of Constance, that the cardinals would break up with their representatives from various countries, and that essentially each country would have a single vote. And therefore the Italian cardinals would not have the upper hand in terms of just sheer numbers. And it's when this decision is made that John the 23rd flees, he attempts to call the council out of order, and he attempts to put a stop to it. However, he simply doesn't have the power to do so. Nevertheless, for the Pope to stand against the council was putting the council on rocky soil. And it's at this point that Gerson steps in and delivers in 1415 a rousing sermon in which he calls for the council to stand up as a council and to heal the church. And so finally, in 1417, the Council of Constance deposes the 3 existing popes, and it elects Martin V. And this time, because of the power of the might of the political regimes that are behind it, Sigismund being the principal one, this time the council's decision went into effect. Europe as a whole essentially stood up and said, we will not have 3 popes, much less 4 popes, if Martin V is unable to cause the others to step down. And so finally the schism is healed in 1417. The council itself, though, issues a decree called Frequens, and this is a decree in which they say, as the name seems to imply, that councils should meet frequently. It argues, in fact, that it should meet at least once every 10 years in order to heal the problems of the church and to keep an eye on the papacy and other things as well. Now, Martin V doesn't like this, but he is forced to sign it. And so what happens is, as the Council of Constance comes to a close, and as we move forward into additional councils that meet just up until the eve of the Reformation, you have this tussle between papal power and conciliar power. Which one is going to have the upper hand? Now, in the end, it is the papacy that wins. And there are lots of swirling events that cause this. At a later date, a council meets, and it again gets into a fight with the papacy, and it resolves to depose the pope and to elect another one, which again erupts into another papal schism. Only this time it is drawn out by a council itself. Now, on and on and on into the Reformation, the debates about papal power and the power of the church as a whole become preeminent. And in fact, it is this move by the church at large that provokes in the papacy a desire to stress the unalloyed authority of the papacy alone, regardless of the power supposedly of councils or of theologians. And so it is telling that when we get to Martin Luther, just again a number of years after the conciliar movement really begins to collapse, that when Luther comes on the scene, the response he gets from the papacy is simply authoritarian. He is to stand down. He is to shut up. If the papacy has decided something, it is his job simply to obey. And so the papacy during the Reformation actually reads Luther as one of these maverick conciliarists who is challenging papal authority, and he needs to simply be put down. In the end, the papal schism further weakened the papacy, and it gave rise to alternative theories about the authority of the Church that did not rely solely on papal authority. Now, over time, the Catholic Church will reject conciliarism in general. And as we move into the early modern world and into the modern world, there arises a more singular doctrine of the idea of papal infallibility. This idea that councils, while important and while vital for the Catholic Church, are themselves not the final court of appeals. Without the papacy, the council is meaningless. More directly, however, there is the problem of the crisis of authority that is the result of the papal schism. The schism weakened the moral integrity of the papacy itself and caused many theologians to challenge the papacy as somehow corrupt and, at least for a few, that the papacy in the Middle Ages was beginning to be seen as the problem, not the solution.